Hey there, welcome to another episode of Speaking of. This is a segment that allows us to explore contemporary issues that are facing our society, and we try to examine these through a Christian lens, through a faith-based lens. We try to ask ourselves the question, how should Christians view and analyze these issues? And anytime we do this, we actually recognize that Christians can and will come to different conclusions about many of these issues. And so even as we faithfully seek to study God's word and to apply the truths of God's word to these contemporary issues, we recognize that Christians can do this together, and yet they can come to different conclusions on these issues. But that's the beauty of this, because it gives us the opportunity to learn from, challenge each other, think through these things, and hopefully learn some things as we go. Today, we're speaking of something known in the United States as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I want to start with a recent story from not too far from here in Salem. It's actually up in Clackamas County. Clackamas County, for the last couple of years, had an office that was dedicated to the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as of earlier this week, they decided to discontinue that particular office. That office was spending nearly $1 million a year to employ, I think it was 2 full-time and 1 part-time staff member to promote the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that event up in Clackamas County actually made national news. And it made national news not because it's the only place where this is happening, but actually because this is just a part of a growing trend of organizations and institutions discontinuing their offices, their respective offices of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The University of North Carolina, for example, just decided to roll back many of their DEI initiatives. Tech companies are doing the same thing. Companies are often doing it rather quietly. They're sort of backing away from supporting these initiatives. But what I want to do a little bit is look at, so this is an event. This is a news story that's made big news lately. There's other ways that it's shown up. The recent resignation of the president of Harvard had ties to this, because many argued that she had her position not because she was the most qualified person for the job, but because the DEI initiatives at Harvard essentially were responsible for promoting a person of a minority person into that position. Now, I'm not here to argue whether that actually happened at Harvard or not. I'm simply relaying that as an example of where people have looked and said, this is what DEI initiatives have done. And others, of course, have said, no, that's not the case. In any case, this whole idea of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, has been big in the news really over the last 5 years. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes, I'm going to first explain what is DEI exactly, what are these initiatives, how did we get here, and then what's been going on more recently, and then we'll try to evaluate whether DEI initiatives are a good thing or a bad thing, should companies and organizations have them or not, and then finally we'll look at a Christian perspective on all this. So what is diversity, equity, and inclusion? DEI, it's a name given to usually a series of policies or initiatives, and sometimes even individuals who work for diversity, equity, and inclusion in an institution, organization, or company. So diversity, when we talk about the D of DEI, we're talking about the promoting of variety within an organizational workforce. And so diversity would mean you include people from varied backgrounds, people from different, male and female, different ethnic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, religions, disabilities, and so on. Equity is the idea that everyone should have the same. Now, I should pause here and say that actually equity is even understood differently. There's essentially 2 different schools of thought. There's equality of outcome, and there's equality of opportunity. equality of opportunity is probably the better way of doing this, which says that everybody should have the same opportunity or the same access to the same opportunities. In other words, you should, as best you can, try to make sure that no one is prevented from, say, applying for a certain position. Now, equality of outcome is a little bit different. Equality of outcome says we really need to make sure that the outcome and sort of is equal. In other words, you might say we need to make sure that we're always having the same number of people from a racial minority, or we need to make sure that we always have the same number of women. Now, that sounds sort of obvious. Like, of course, you would want that, but it actually gets more difficult because if you look at certain fields which tend to be geared towards certain genders, for example, you know, nurses tend to be not exclusively, and that's not even saying that, you know, you should have it this way necessarily, but nurses, the field of nursing tends to be dominated by women, and the field of construction tends to be dominated by men. So equality of opportunity would say, well, anyone who wants to be a nurse or anyone who wants to be a contractor or a builder should have the opportunity to pursue the skills and the training necessary and should have the opportunity to pursue those jobs as they are available. Equality of outcome would say, well, actually, we need to make sure that we have the same number of people, the same number of men and women in each of those fields. And of course, that gets much more difficult. So it's important to kind of just define your terms there. In any case, equity refers to making sure that there's, you know, fair compensation, that men and women are paid the same, that you're representing, you know, that different groups have different opportunities to apply for similar positions. And then finally, inclusion. Inclusion is the commitment to making sure that all voices are heard and that you're not marginalizing any one group of people within an organization. So you know, if you're running a college or a university, you want to make sure inclusion is the idea that says, well, we want to make sure that we're hearing from, say, students who are disabled, or we want to make sure that we're hearing from students who are of minority background. So diversity, equity, inclusion refers to those ideas, and it's a commitment to promoting those ideals within a workplace in things like hiring practices, promotions, you know, visioning, planning for the organization, all kinds of different such things. Diversity, equity, inclusion is actually not a new concept. It's been around for a very long time, and it can probably be traced, the modern expression of it can probably be traced back to the time of JFK. Under JFK, that's actually when affirmative action, which is often kind of lumped in with DEI stuff, JFK and his administration basically said that anytime the government is contracting with private employers, anytime there's government contracting work, the government, and I'll quote here, the government needs to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and employees are treated fairly during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. So JFK said, when the government is giving out work, you need to make sure that everyone has the opportunity, and you need to take affirmative action to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to be treated the same. Now, the interesting thing is that actually when this was all passed, back in the 1960s, when these policies were put in place, it was explicitly stated that there would not be quotas as part of this legislation. In other words, they said, we're not going to mandate a specific number of racial minorities or genders or whatever else. In fact, it was kind of a famous thing. Hubert Humphrey during this time said, if quotas are put in place, Humphrey said, I will eat my hat. Now, of course, the interesting thing and the concerning thing to some would be that actually since that time, quotas have been implemented and they were part of this. They were sort of the expansion of it. So this was an idea that was committed to the idea of justice and equality, and then it was expanded to include mandating quotas in, you know, hiring practices, but also in university admission, college admissions. Ronald Reagan, so we're in the 1980s, Reagan actually tried to dismantle a lot of these affirmative action laws. But during that time, the ideals of DEI really morphed into what became an entire industry. But it was a pretty small little industry. It wasn't something that had a lot of traction yet. But I want to put up a screen here, and I want to just kind of show you something as to how this grew as time went on. Now, it's going to be this is not the best graph because it's missing some important data, but these are, these are as the years go by. That's each of these bars represents a different year. This here represents 2008. And you can start to see that, okay, it's slowly been trending up. And then here you get the economic crisis and the economic meltdown of 2008. Probably more relevant to our purposes, though, here is 2016. Now, what happened in 2016? Well, that was the year that Trump was elected. And so arguably that for some led to a lot of concerns. It led to people believing that Trump would be marginalizing people of minority backgrounds. It led to concerns. The Charlottesville riot of the Charlottesville demonstration of 2017 would have been in there as well. And so you can see that now the trend is starting to go up. This would be the year and actually I think this I should probably clarify here, because if my memory is right, I might got the dates a little bit long. This would actually be the year 2017, when Trump was inaugurated. So that's 17, 18, 19, 20. Well, what happened in the year 2020? Well, with respect to racial actions, that was the year that George Floyd was killed in what was it, Minneapolis. And so all of a sudden, then you see that this really took off. And it suddenly became a massively popular industry, DEI. So companies were hiring people, staffing. People were I think the numbers are something like it turned into a multi-billion-dollar industry. And the number of DEI listings, like on LinkedIn, it went up like 168% in just a matter of years. In 13 years, the number of job titles with the word diversity or inclusion in it, so like it might be, coordinator of diversity or coordinator of inclusion, the number of job titles with that in 13 years has quadrupled. And so workplaces have been scrambling to recruit and to hire and to make sure that they have these offices and individuals and workers committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, so that takes us up to about 2022, 2023. Something began to change in the year 2023. All of a sudden, that multi-year, really sharp uptick in hirings of people committed who had the job specifically set on DEI policies. Suddenly, those numbers began to shrink almost as sharply as they climbed. And some of that had to do with economic slowdown. So all of a sudden, the economy is not as good as it once was. At least that's the perception of it. And so companies that once were real quick to hire these individuals, suddenly they were the first to go when the economy began to take a hit. And so where we're at today is actually those numbers of, again, we're looking only at companies, organizations, institutions with positions committed specifically to promoting DEI policies. Those numbers have dropped off very, very sharply. And that sort of brings us to Clackamas County, because they're yet another organization, another institution, a city government, or a county government, I should say, that has committed and has decided to no longer spend I think it's $22,000 or something like that per year on promoting DEI in the workplace. Other organizations are following suit. One of the questions that we have to ask is it actually effective? Do DEI policies actually work? That's a question to consider in all of this. The research is not very clear, and it's a little bit hard to measure. One of the things that the Pew Research found that only about half of the people in the workplace found it to be either very helpful or somewhat helpful. So when they surveyed all these people about, is it helpful? Has it made a difference in your workplace? Only about half of the respondents came back and said, yes, it is either very helpful or it's somewhat helpful. Now, predictably, the responses when you categorize it by gender, ethnicity, or race and political leanings, the lines were very, very predictable. At least in my opinion, the data was very predictable. So people who either identify as Democrat or lean towards Democrat, people who are of a minority race, or people who are women. Those are the demographics that tend to be more likely to favor and to believe that these policies are actually effective. And then people that are of the majority race, people that are men and people that vote or lean Republican tend to be the most likely to say that they do not work and they don't favor them in the workplace. Now, you can pull those numbers apart probably, but that's just a demographic survey. Now, the interesting thing is, I think of all the minority groups that tended to believe that these policies are favorable or effective, it was the African Americans that were the highest percentage, and other minority cultural groups, say Asians or Hispanics, they tended to be far less likely to see such policies favorably. Still, a majority of them did see them favorably, but they were much closer to the center than African Americans. And I don't know exactly what that means, other than to just kind of put that out there and say it was an interesting piece of data. What is what is a critique? What should we take away from this? And I want to sort of approach this in two ways. I want to first affirm that I think these policies come from a place that is at least probably mostly commendable. In other words, and I'm going to say more about this in a minute, the commitment to inclusion and diversity, it's pretty hard to argue with that on principle. Like, it's pretty hard to say, you know what, we should really try to be as homogeneous as we can. Like, very few people would hold to that position, although unfortunately there are some who do. And that's obviously like a major problem, but that's a very small percentage of people who believe that we should be homogeneous. Most people actually believe that, generally speaking, diversity is a good thing, or at least that it's part of the society and the culture that we live in. But the problem comes in is, so the question, it seems, at least in my view, the question is more about, does DEI training actually serve that purpose? And that's where, and the reason I think that distinction is important is because people who tend to oppose DEI policies can easily be mischaracterized as being, well, you're just racist, or you don't value inclusion, or you don't value diversity. And I actually think that's a logical fallacy. I believe that's an ad hominem fallacy. It's really looking at people who oppose DEI policies, and it's automatically dismissing them and labeling them racist. And I don't think that's actually accurate, and I don't think that's really a fair characterization. Because I think people who oppose DEI policies oppose them more on the basis of their effectiveness and on the basis of the unintended consequence. So, for example, DEI training purports to promote diversity and inclusion and equity in the workplace, but a lot of times it ends up functioning more as a tool. Many people see it this way. It functions as a tool to just avoid litigation. It's like, well, we have these policies in place, and we have them in place because we want to be able to show that we didn't discriminate against a minority. Well, that's all well and good, but that doesn't really promote the ideals of diversity, inclusion, and equity. It simply promotes the idea of, we don't want to get sued. We want to cover our butts legally. Many colleges and universities, as part of these DEI processes, have had their faculty members and potential applicants, they've insisted that they write a statement of DEI. And so they're called DEI statements. So every faculty member has to write a statement about their commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, well, that all sounds wonderful, but the problem is, what happens if you agree with those policies? What happens if you or if you agree with the ideal but you disagree with the policy. So you're a professor, you write a DEI statement, and you are critical of your university's policies. Suddenly you're on the hot seat. If you're already a faculty member, you actually run the risk, a very serious risk of not getting tenure. Or if you're an applicant for a new position, you can all but kiss that job goodbye. You will not get hired on. So here's what people of course learn to do is you write the statement. Some people just say, well, fine, I'll write a statement. I know, you can even get AI to write it, get ChatGPT to write your DEI statement. You can do that. And then, a university can pat themselves on the back and say, well, this is good because we've had everybody, look at all of our faculty are committed to DEI. Well, no, you haven't changed anything. You've simply got people to go along. You've conformed them externally. And that's one of the problems with many DEI policies is that they, at least in my judgment, they tend to focus on externals. They tend to focus on getting people to perform. They'll have people that pays lip service to diversity and equity and inclusion, but really it's not really changing the fundamental condition of a person's heart. And at its worst, DEI policies can talk all about inclusion and bringing multiple voices to the table, but it functions in very much, so that's sort of the unintended consequences. That actually functions in silencing those other voices. So if you have a view that is not in the majority and on any sort of issue. So in a church context, if you believe that same-sex marriage is wrong and you speak out against that, then you can actually be marginalized for that or other similar things. So it pays lip service to the idea of different viewpoints and perspectives, and we want to hear from everybody. But in reality, what ends up happening is if you speak against the majority opinion, or if you speak against what are some of the prevailing cultural values, you end up being marginalized and excluded, and to use a modern term, you end up being canceled. And so DEI sounds nice, but it ends up it does not promote the very values that it claims to promote. The other thing is that it can actually it actually can backfire. It actually, for all the talk about including people and including varied people from varied backgrounds, it actually and minimizing discrimination, DEI actually can become a tool for discrimination. But here's another example. UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, they tried a pilot project where they were trying to apply these principles of DEI. And so they had an open faculty position, and they had something like 894 applicants, and they all had to write, their diversity statement as part of the application process. And I don't know exactly how they examined it, if it was examined by, sometimes computers can sort of analyze resumes and applications and so on, but whether it was done that way or whether it was an individual reading them over, the DEI statements, when they were read, immediately the applicant pool was reduced to 214. In other words, about 75% of the application pool, roughly, that number's not very precise, but pretty close to it. Nearly 75% of the applicant pool was thrown out on the basis of their DEI statements. Now, that strikes me as, and then the second round, I think it reduced it down to right away down to 22. But it seems to me that just using a DEI statement would have discriminated against a lot of people who would have been otherwise qualified for the job. The only thing that disqualified 75% of the applicant pool in this case was their DEI statements. And that immediately weeded out. So for all the talk about diversity and difference of opinions and perspectives, it seems that the very tenets of DEI were used to promote discrimination. The other, and this is kind of the final critique, and that's that what DEI does is it tends to accentuate and put the focus on the differences between individuals within a larger group. So if you have a workplace of, say, 15 people, DEI training will tend to focus on highlighting all the ways that the people in the office are different. So the person of a, Middle Eastern descent and the person of Native American descent. And it tries to put the focus on all of that, which sounds good. But Jonathan Haidt, who is a sociologist, he's actually done some research on this, and he actually and understand that Jonathan Haidt is writing. He's coming out of a perspective that was, by his own admission, was very progressive and very liberal, and I say that because this is something that you might expect a more conservative leaning person to say, but in fact, this is a person who at one time was very, very progressive and liberal in his politics, and he sort of moved a little more towards the libertarian end of things. So that maybe gives some context, but actually Jonathan Haidt comes to the conclusion that policies that accentuate and highlight differences actually don't have the desired effect of creating a sense of unity within a group. It actually further divides and splinters them, because all it's doing is it's pointing you to the things that separate you. And so while it's good and it's important to explore and to value cultural differences, Haidt would say you need to focus on what a group has in common, and that would be, your shared commitment to sales and your shared commitment to the vision of the company, and so on and so forth. And that tends to have the better effect of bringing unity within a group. So it can create more division. It's interesting. I mentioned earlier the story up in Clackamas County. DEI there, and there's an example where it really, these policies really splintered that group, because when Clackamas County was looking at trying to roll back this, defund the office and discontinue this office, they were having these public meetings, and the county commissioner that was proposing this was actually booed and taunted very loudly in a very disrespectful way. Now, the interesting thing about that to me is that, this was not quite as widely reported, but the interesting thing is that the county commissioner in question here, who was being accused of being anti-diversity and so on, he's actually a gay father raising a black son. And so here's an instance where, now I'm not necessarily, saying, I'm just kind of describing the demographic there, because here you get an example of how DEI policies were weaponized against a person, someone who in his very way of living embraced the ideals of DEI. And so you focus on all the things that differ rather than on the things that are the same. So what ought Christians to think of DEI? How should we process all of this? I think there's a few sort of principles that begin to emerge. The first is this: Christians ought to be free and open in recognizing the sin of racism wherever they see it. And I say that because sometimes our response as Christians, our response to the problem of racism is really just to deny it. It's to actually minimize the realities of it. We sort of like to, it's more convenient for us to say, well, that doesn't happen anymore. Now, incidentally, I actually think that that racism, at least in a public setting, and is actually is declined significantly. It's not all the way gone, and that's why we ought to be able to acknowledge that it still exists. My belief for that, my conviction for that, comes out of the fact that racism is a sin that's pretty deeply rooted in human nature, but maybe not always in the way that we might think. Racism, the biblical picture of racism starts all the way back in Genesis 11, where what people did as sin sort of permeated the world, and the curse of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, what people did is they began to ground and root their identity in their language, their cultural background, and then they sort of just kind of clustered together with people who are most like them. And when you take any part of your identity, any part of who you are, and you sort of say, this is, you sort of ground your identity on that, you elevate that particular quality, you almost automatically begin to look down on people who don't have that. And that's not a new problem. That is a fundamental result and effect of this of sin in the world. And so as Christians, we have to be able to name that as sin. I've said this before. I've had the opportunity in my life to travel to many, many, many different countries around the world. Everywhere I've gone, everywhere without exception, this problem exists. So this is not a new problem. It's not a problem limited to any one particular culture. It is everywhere. And as Christians, we can speak about that. We have, I think, a better better grounding, a better, more rich theological understanding to speak about the realities of sin, namely that it's part of the fallen human condition in which we tend to ground our identity in a part of our our own gender, ethnicity, cultural background. The Bible talks about this and makes mention of it. Actually, you read the hostility between Jews and Gentiles. You read about the hostility between Jews and Samaritans. Galatians chapter 2 has Paul confronting Peter about Peter's own prejudices. The book of Acts chapter 10 has accounts of the same problem. Ephesians chapter 2. So the Bible speaks pretty clearly about our tendency to group ourselves together with people who are most like us, and then to look down on people who are not. And we ought to be able to name that. We ought not to shy away from that, because I think we have better currency for speaking of and describing and understanding this problem than a non-Christian worldview. The second thing is that we ought to, maybe the second thing follows then from that, which is that we ought to recognize that the true solution to racial problems is not ultimately, it's not found in human solutions. It's not found in human ideas. It's ultimately found in and through the person and work of Jesus Christ. And as a Christian, I believe that this is the true answer, because the gospel actually levels the ground. The gospel says that we are no different. Our identity in terms of our race, ethnicity, gender, etc., does not ultimately define us, but I am first and foremost a human being made in the image of God, but fallen by the effects of sin and in need of a savior. That makes me exactly the same as my African American neighbor, my Hispanic neighbor, my Asian, my whoever. So there I'm on level ground where I can't claim superiority, because I'm just as fallen and broken as the rest of them. And Jesus is the one who saves me, and Jesus is the one, whether I'm Hispanic, African American, Asian, whatever. Jesus is the hope for any and all. And so that sort of levels the ground. That gives us a better solution to the problem of racism. And I think the motive then is changed too, because then the motive for pursuing racial reconciliation and racial renewal, whatever else you want to call it, the motive moves from being guilt, which is so much about the world's approach to solving this problem. It's driven by guilt. It's driven by pride. It's driven by political correctness. It's driven by all these other things. Whereas for the Christian, the motive can be, you know what? The true motive is the power of God. It's worship at who Jesus is. It's gratitude for all that God has done. So it changes the entire motive. And as Christians, we ought to be, sort of like we have, I think, this ultimate solution that we ought to be very bold and confident in. And then maybe the last two things just to say on this is that we ought to value diversity at the deepest level, because God values diversity. Diversity is something, cultural diversity is something created by God. God created and intended the multicultural world in which we live. Culture and multiculturalism is a good thing. The many different cultures of this world, with all their different cultural expressions, be it in food or in dress or music or art or whatever else, cultural diversity it's a good thing. It's something valued by God. Yes, it's affected by sin, right? All cultures and races and ethnicities and so on affected by sin, but still valued by God. This diversity is deeply precious to God. And as Christians, what we do is we say, well, if it matters to God, then it should matter to us. But again, what's happening is the sort of the values of our heart are being recalibrated. So we don't pursue racial reconciliation out of a sense of, well, we need to be politically correct and I'm better than you because I'm more racially sensitive than you, but we view it as this matters to God, so it matters to me. That's heart change, and that's something I think better. And we learn then to appreciate all these different values. That's sort of one of the reasons why, just if you're looking for a fun way to apply an idea like this, it's like, well, go out for Chinese food, or like go to an authentic, like Panda Express doesn't really count, but go to an authentic restaurant that reflects a different culture and learn from it and value it and appreciate it. And then pursue that diversity wherever you have the influence to do so. So you recognize that people of different cultures and backgrounds will tend to have different perspectives, and but you pursue that in your workplace, because that's what the kingdom of God looks like. And so if maybe you're a person who's hiring, you're going to want to hire people from different backgrounds, not because you want to meet some quota, whether it's visible, spoken or unspoken, but because that's what the kingdom of God looks like. And so you pursue that, and you work through the challenges that brings in your workplace. You realize that when you get people of different cultures and backgrounds, it sometimes does create tension and friction, because different people have different ways of looking at issues and working through them, but you committed to it because you recognize that that's what the kingdom of God is all about. So there you go. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment. Agree, disagree, put your comments down in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'd love to see you again when we are speaking of the next issue.